The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are connected at the hip.
And she says when it comes to Nancy Guthrie, she believes investigative genetic genealogy will crack this.
Across the country, people are watching this case. An 84-year-old woman, a grandmother, a neighbor, someone's entire world vanishes from her own home, and the nation wants answers. But tonight, we're not just reporting on what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Tonight, we're reporting on the man who is supposed to be finding her. Because while Sheriff Chris Nanos has been standing at podiums, giving press conferences, and reassuring a grieving community that justice is coming, investigative journalists have been quietly pulling on a different thread. And what unraveled is something the sheriff never expected anyone to find. 40 years of carefully buried history, a forced resignation, disciplinary files that should have disqualified him from ever holding a badge of this magnitude, and a 2-year gap on his public résumé that, until now, nobody ever asked him to explain. This is not a story about a distraction. This is a story about a pattern. And in a case as fragile, as time-sensitive, and as devastating as the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, patterns matter enormously. So tonight, we hold two threads at once. We follow the case, and we follow the man. Let's start with what we know about Nancy. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, was last seen at her home. By all accounts, she was sharp, independent, and deeply embedded in her community. She was not someone who simply wandered off. She was not someone whose disappearance could be explained away by confusion or accident. The timeline of her disappearance is precise, and it is chilling. On the morning she vanished, neighbors noticed nothing unusual, but investigators would later determine that her home security cameras, the very cameras that might have captured exactly what happened, had been disabled. Not malfunctioned, disabled. There was blood on the porch. A small amount, yes, but enough to tell investigators that whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie did not happen quietly, and it did not happen somewhere else. It happened at her front door, at the entrance to the place she was supposed to be safest. Since that morning, law enforcement has launched one of the largest missing persons investigations in the region's recent memory. The reward money currently stands at a figure significant enough to motivate anyone with real information to come forward. Tiplins have received hundreds of calls, and yet no arrests, no charges, no named suspect. When reporters press Sheriff Nanos for specifics, the answers follow a familiar rhythm. We are making progress. We are getting closer. We cannot compromise the integrity of the investigation. These are not answers. These are holding statements. And when you understand what we are about to tell you about Sheriff Nanos' history, you begin to wonder whether the vagueness is about protecting the investigation or protecting himself. What we are about to share comes from verified public records, archived newspaper reporting, and documentation reviewed by multiple journalists independently. This is not rumor. This is not speculation. This is paper. 40 years ago, Chris Nanos was a law enforcement officer in a different jurisdiction, younger, ambitious, and already controversial. According to documents reviewed from regional newspaper archives dating to that period, Nanos was the subject of multiple internal disciplinary proceedings during his tenure. The infractions documented in those files include insubordination toward superior officers and at least one substantiated complaint involving excessive use of force. A complaint serious enough to trigger a formal departmental review rather than an informal reprimand. He was suspended. Then quietly, he was gone. The official narrative Nanos has maintained throughout his career describes his departure from that department as voluntary, a personal decision to pursue other opportunities. His public résumé, as filed with the county, supported this story, but the records tell a different story. Sources familiar with the proceedings from that era confirm that Nanos did not leave voluntarily. He was forced to resign, offered the choice between resignation and formal termination, a common arrangement designed to allow the department to avoid protracted legal proceedings while allowing the officer to preserve the appearance of a clean exit. And then there is the gap between his departure from that department and his reappearance in public service records. There is a period of approximately 2 years that remains completely unaccounted for on any official document he has submitted. 2 years, in a career built on the public trust. No employer listed, no explanation offered, no one, until now, apparently thought to ask. The question is not merely what happened during those 2 years. The question is, how did a man with sealed disciplinary records of forced resignation and an unexplained gap in his professional history rise to become the sheriff overseeing one of the most watched missing persons cases in this state's recent history? When journalists first approached the sheriff's department with these findings, presenting the documented records, the archived filings, and the timeline discrepancies, the response was immediate, and it was revealing. Sheriff Nanos, when confronted directly, did not engage with the substance of the records. He did not offer an explanation for the 2-year gap. He did not address the disciplinary filings by name. Instead, he dismissed the entire inquiry as, and this is a near-direct quote, a hit piece designed to interfere with an active investigation. He smiled when he said it. That smile is worth noting, because a man with nothing to hide does not smile at questions about why his résumé doesn't match the public record. A man with nothing to hide says, "Here is the explanation." He doesn't call it a hit piece and walk away. Within days of those initial press inquiries, something quiet happened inside the department. The version of Nanos's professional biography that had been publicly accessible on the county's official website was updated. The 2-year gap did not become filled with new information. It was simply restructured, the dates around it slightly reframed. When a local reporter flagged the change and asked for clarification, a department spokesperson described it as a clerical error, a routine correction to a formatting issue. A formatting issue does not change employment dates. A formatting issue does not reorder a timeline. What happened in those days between the initial press inquiry and the website update was not clerical. It was careful, and careful in this context is a word that should concern every person following the Nancy Guthrie case. Some people will argue that what a man did 40 years ago should stay 40 years ago, that people deserve the opportunity to change, that disciplinary history from a different era, in a different jurisdiction, should have no bearing on how we evaluate a current investigation. That argument would be reasonable if the patterns had stopped. They have not. The behaviors documented in those sealed files from 4 decades ago, the resistance to oversight, the dismissal of criticism, the instinct to avoid accountability rather than address it, those behaviors have direct, observable parallels in how this investigation has been conducted from its earliest hours. Let's go through them specifically. First, the crime scene. In the critical hours immediately following Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, when physical evidence is at its most intact, when contamination is most preventable, the scene was not adequately secured. Multiple individuals, some with no clear forensic or investigative role, had access to the immediate area. In high-profile cases, this is not a minor procedural footnote. Evidence secured in the first hours is often the evidence that closes the case. Evidence compromised in those same hours is often the reason cases go cold. Second, the DNA testing decision. Rather than routing forensic evidence through the FBI laboratory system, a federally accredited infrastructure with standardized protocols, chain of custody documentation, and independent oversight, Nanos's department chose to use a private lab. This decision was made without public explanation. Private labs are not inherently unreliable, but in a case of this visibility, with this much at stake, the choice to bypass federal resources in favor of a private arrangement raises legitimate questions about transparency and, ultimately, about who controls the results. Third, the rejection of outside help. In the weeks following Nancy's disappearance, multiple offers of assistance from volunteer search organizations with documented track records, from retired law enforcement professionals with relevant expertise, were declined or went unanswered by the department. When pressed on this, the response from Nanos's office defaulted to the same language he uses for everything. The investigation is being handled. Outside interference could compromise the process. Trust the department. This is the language of a man who does not want observers in the room. 40 years ago, that same instinct, to shut out oversight rather than welcome it, ended his career in another jurisdiction. Today, it is shaping the investigation into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman whose family is still waiting. Despite everything, despite the mismanagement, the secrecy, the questions about leadership, this investigation has produced real leads. And those leads deserve to be on the record. Investigators and community members have noted something unusual in the days surrounding Nancy's disappearance. Damage to utility infrastructure in the immediate vicinity of her home. Specifically, external utility boxes showed signs of interference that were not consistent with weather or standard wear. Whether this interference was connected to the disabling of her security cameras, whether someone with knowledge of the infrastructure deliberately created a blind spot, remains an open question. But it is a question that serious investigators should be pursuing aggressively. Additionally, multiple residents have reported seeing unfamiliar individuals in the neighborhood in the weeks prior to Nancy's disappearance. The descriptions are not identical, but the time frame clusters in a way that investigators have found notable. At least one of those reported sightings falls within a specific date range that, according to sources close to the investigation, aligns with a window that has drawn significant forensic attention. These are not random tips. These are data points with geographic and temporal coherence. And then there are the dead ends. DNA samples collected from the scene and submitted for testing have, according to available reporting, not produced a match to any individual currently in investigative focus. The initial forensic returns, rather than narrowing the field, appear to have complicated it. Physical evidence collected in the early days, evidence that investigators were initially confident about, has, in at least one documented instance, been assessed and effectively cleared from active consideration. This is not unusual in complex cases. Dead ends are part of investigation, but dead ends hit differently when the foundation underneath the investigation, the leadership, the protocols, the transparency, is already compromised. We have spent a significant portion of this report on Sheriff Chris Nanos, on his history, on his decisions, on the gap between the story he has told about himself and the story the records tell. That reporting matters. It is relevant. It belongs in this conversation. But we want to be precise about why it belongs here. It does not belong here because we are interested in destroying a career or settling a score. It belongs here because Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, blood on her porch, cameras dark, weeks now turning into longer, deserves an investigation that is above reproach. She deserves leadership that can withstand scrutiny. She deserves a process that the public can trust, because public trust is what generates tips, and tips are often what brings people home. When the man running that process has spent decades concealing a forced resignation, has responded to legitimate questions by calling them hit pieces, and has made a series of early investigative decisions that experienced law enforcement professionals have quietly described as irregular. That is not a distraction from Nancy's case. That is Nancy's case. Her family is still waiting. Every day that passes without an arrest, without a named suspect, without a credible public accounting of what is being done and why. Every one of those days is a day her family carries something no family should have to carry alone. Nancy Guthrie deserves better than vague assurances. She deserves better than a crime scene that wasn't protected, than forensic choices made without explanation, than outside help that was turned away without justification. She deserves the full weight of accountability, not just from whoever is responsible for what happened on her porch, but from every person whose job it is to find out. If you have information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, anything you saw, anything that seemed strange, any interaction in that neighborhood in the weeks before she vanished, the tip line remains open. Share this information. Share this report. Keep the spotlight on. Because the moment a story like this fades from public attention is the moment the people who depend on that attention lose their best protection. Nancy is still out there. Her family is still waiting. And the truth, all of it, still needs to come out.